Hello, everybody. Thank you all for coming. We're delighted that you could be here. I must say I've been looking forward to this for weeks. This is when David said that he was willing to come and do this. I thought this is great because I must say, and I'm not doing this just to blow smoke at him, but I think he's the most interesting intellect in Washington these days. He integrates so many it's a low. It's a low bar. It's a very low bar. But you pole vault over it. So let's just say but such an interesting intellect. And we're the great beneficiaries here at CSIS. We call on David frequently to participate in projects with us, conferences and that sort. And he invariably says yes, and he invariably has the most interesting things to say. So when the last meeting when he was here and I heard his book was coming out, I said, well, we really would like to do an event, and he said he agreed to do it now. So I did get an advance copy, and in my reading of this, I don't know how many of you have had a chance to read it yet, but I just couldn't resist. Now, if you get to chapter 20, he talks about think tanks. Okay, now there's just a very interesting, there's a cross street in Washington, D.C. with a think tank on each corner. There's a foreign policy think tank, a domestic policy think tank, an international economics think tank, and one that specializes in regulatory affairs. Many people consider this to be the most boring place on the face of the earth. He then goes on to say, now the senior fellows are comprised of former deputy secretaries of this or that department. This got a little close to home. Former deputy secretaries of this or that department engaged in a Washington institution called, and this is in capitals, Powerless Lunch. Powerless Lunch, in which two previously influential people dine and have portentous conversations of no importance whatsoever. So now So I'm reading this, and I say to my wife, I said, he couldn't possibly be talking about CSIS, And my wife said, but he certainly drew his inspiration from you. So, and I tell you, it's the liveliness and the energy and the fun of this book that we're going to be just sharing with each other this afternoon in this conversation. I don't want to take another minute from you, so I introduce to you David Brooks.
His name is in the footnotes for that sentence. Thank you, John. It's a great pleasure to be back in this room. Usually when I'm in this room, I'm talking about the Middle East, but this will be an even more fractious zone, the space between our ears. And so it grew out of politics. When I took my current job, I was given a good piece of advice by Robert Novak, which was to interview 3 politicians every day. And so I spent a lot of time around them. I just came from a bunch of them. And I can tell you they're all emotional freaks of one sort or another. If you spend time around them, they have what I call logorrhea dementia, which is they talk so much they drive themselves insane. But they do have incredible social skills. And so if you meet a politician, they stand too close to you, they grab your lapels, they'll rub the back of your head. I mentioned on TV, unfortunately, a couple of years ago that I had dinner with a Republican senator who had his hand on my thigh the whole meal, sort of squeezing it and kneading it for emphasis. The story I tell about Ted Kennedy, I was once in the Senate press gallery. I looked down, and Ted Kennedy and Dan Quayle were meeting each other, and they were friends, and they gave each other a big hug. And their faces were like this far apart, and their arms were going up and down each other's backs, and they were sort of moving and grinding away down there. And I was like, get a room, I don't want to see this. And then my Clinton story, which I call reporting, but you'll call name dropping, is I'm walking through a Boston hotel lobby. Clinton comes out of the elevator and sees me and starts praising me for a column I'd written praising him, which he thought was particularly brilliant. And so but then a crowd gathers as they see Clinton's in the hotel lobby, and he wants to embrace them into our conversation. So he starts walking backwards while he's talking to me. And so within a few minutes, he's like 80 feet away, way over there, just talking to me. And so that's just incredible crowd awareness. And then finally, I was covering Mitt Romney up in New Hampshire, the last presidential cycle, and he was up there campaigning with his 5 perfect sons, Bip, Chip, Rip, Sip, Dip, and Limp and Skip. And he goes into a diner in New Hampshire. He goes up to each table, and he introduces himself to each family in the diner, and asks what village in New Hampshire they're from, and then he describes the home he owns in their village. And he goes, he goes from table to table, introducing, meets like 30, 40 people. On the way out, he first names almost everybody he's just met. And so that is a degree of social skill. And so they have the ability to finely attune to other people's moods, I would say. And yet when you cover them when they're actually doing politics or mostly governance, often that all fades away. That when they're campaigning, it's sort of borrowed, canned emotions, very crude. And when they're governing, it's almost no emotions. They turn into human CBO reports. And so I've covered a series of policy failures which derive from the fact that the people who govern often do not have a very sophisticated view of human nature. And so I covered the decline of the Soviet Union, the rise of Russia, and when I was there, we sent plenty of economists with hard currency plans and privatization plans. But what the Soviet Union really, or Russia really lacked was social trust, and everybody was going to steal everything. And we were sort of oblivious to that. In Iraq, we sent the military. I think our leaders were oblivious to the psychological and cultural realities of Iraq. I once asked a senior member of the Bush administration, didn't you guys get the culture of Iraq wrong? And this person said, I don't really believe in culture. I think if you change the institutions, you change the culture. And that's the correct political science answer, but it's not the correct answer. And then we had a financial system based on the supposition that bankers were prudent, rational creatures who would never do anything stupid en masse. And that turned out not to be true. And then the issue I care most about is education. I've covered education reform for the past 30 years since the Nation at Risk report. And we've tried a whole series of reforms that have yielded disappointing results because they skirt the core issue, which is the individual relationship between a teacher and a student. People learn from people they love, but if you mention the word love at a congressional hearing, they look at you like you're Oprah. And so the question I was entertained with throughout much of my career is, why are the most socially attuned people conducting policy based on a very shallow and asocial view of human nature? And so I came to the conclusion this is not only a problem of politics, it's a wider cultural problem. And that for centuries we've inherited a view that we're divided selves, that we have reason over here, we have emotions and the soft stuff over there, and they're sort of on a teeter-totter, that when reason is up, emotion is down, and vice versa, and that we have progress to the extent that reason can conquer the emotions. And so this has led to a view of human nature, which we have in the policy world, that people are or should be encouraged to be rational, utility-maximizing individuals. And economics has become the gateway between the world of research and the world of policymaking. It's also led to the view in the academy that people can be studied using the methodologies of physics, which emphasize the things that can be counted and measured and amputate all the rest. And so this amputation in the world of the academy and in the world of policy is part of a broader cultural amputation, which means we're really good at talking about material things and really bad at talking about emotions. We're really good at talking about, when we raise our kids, about skills and safety, but bad about talking the most important thing, which is character, which is harder to define. And so if you go out to where I live out in Bethesda, you see this bias, this sort of cultural prevailing wind reflected in the way kids are raised. And so I live near an elementary school out by River Road called Burning Tree Elementary. And if you drive by there at 3 in the afternoon, the kids who are weighed down with books have these 80-pound backpacks, and the wind blows them over. They're like beetles sort of stuck there on the ground. And because it's Bethesda, there are cars lined up to pick up the kids, and they're usually Saabs and Audis and Volvos, because up there it's socially acceptable to have a luxury car, so long as it comes from a country hostile to U.S. foreign policy. And so there are these creatures who come out and pick them up, who in an earlier book I called Uber moms, who are highly successful career women who've taken time off to make sure all their kids get into Harvard. And you can usually tell the Uber moms because they actually weigh less than their own children. Sort of at the moment of conception, they're doing little butt exercises to stay fit and trim, and then in the delivery room, they're cutting the umbilical cord, adjusting the video lighting, flashing Mandarin flashcards at the little things to get them ready. And they go off to, in my neighborhood, Walt Whitman High School, when they become sort of the junior workaholics of America, trained and honed in every way, but sometimes not reminded what character is. And it's sort of the tiger momization. And then when they think about morality, they're good people and they have good moral impulses, but often they're kind of inarticulate about what morality is. Alistair MacIntyre, the great philosopher, said, "We have words like honor and virtue and courage, but we no longer have the underlying system tying all that together." And I think that's reasonably accurate, a depiction of our inarticulateness. And at least in Bethesda, when we try to think more morally, we often end up thinking about shopping. So we go to Ben & Jerry's Ice Cream, which is downtown in Bethesda, an ice cream company with its own foreign policy. I joked in one of my books that Ben & Jerry's should make a pacifist toothpaste, doesn't kill germs, just ask them to leave. It would be a big seller. And then right by Walt Whitman High School, we have a Whole Foods, which is where you can buy sort of morally enlightened grocery stores. It's one of the grocery stores where all the cashiers look like they're on loan from Amnesty International. And they have these sort of morally enlightened snacks, which couldn't be pretzels and potato chips because that would be vulgar. So they have the seaweed-based snacks, which we buy in my household. It's called Veggie Booty with Kale, which is for kids who come home and say, Mom, I want a snack that'll help prevent colon rectal cancer. And so this is sort of a shallower society than it needs to be, both in the policy world, but also in the moral and the child-rearing world. And so I'm sort of grappling with this over a series of years, and then it occurs to me that this is not all there is, or I find a body of research, ongoing research, suggesting this is not all there is. And the odd thing is this research isn't in the world of theology and philosophy, which usually tells us the deepest nature of ourselves. It's in the realm of people who study the mind. Cognitive scientists, neuroscientists, behavioral economics, psychologists, sociologists. And they're making incredible progress over the last 30 years about what's going on inside. And the interesting thing for me was that though they work in the fields of science and they use sophisticated fMRI technology, the version of human nature they're unearthing or discovering is an enchanted, very humanistic version. And it's more or less it's based on three key insights. The first key insight is that even though the conscious mind writes the autobiography of our species, most of our thinking is unconscious. And so the human mind can take in about 12 million pieces of information, of which it can be consciously aware of about 40. So most thinking is happening below awareness. And now a lot of this thinking down there has its peculiarities. One of my favorite bits of research by a guy at the University of Buffalo says that people named Dennis are disproportionately likely to become dentists. People named Lawrence become lawyers, because unconsciously, even if a little, we just gravitate toward the familiar, which is why my daughter is named President of the United States, Brooks. Another thing about Dan Ariely, who I think is now at Duke, found that when you eat alone, you eat this much. When you eat with one other person, you eat on average 35% more, 3 other people on average 78% more. And so we're not aware of this, but these are just ways we're reacting unconsciously. And these unconscious processes have their problems, but often they're quite smart. And so if you have trouble deciding between two options, one thing you can do is you can flip a coin, and then don't go say, okay, I'll settle it by a coin flip, but don't go by whether it comes up heads or tails. Go by your emotional reaction to how it came up. Are you happy or sad it came up that way? And it may not be the right answer, but it's the answer deep down inside you want to be the right answer. And so that's the first insight, the power of unconscious thinking. The second insight is that emotions, far from being separate from reason, are at the absolute center of reason. They're the foundation of reason. People who have brain lesions who can't process emotion are not super smart Mr. Spocks, they're super dumb. They can't value things. What emotions do is tell us what we want, what we don't want, what we admire, what we detest. They assign value to things. And if you can't assign value, your landscape is hopelessly flat and you can't make decisions. And so emotions are really the foundation for reason, not the opposite of reason. And so I'm a middle-aged guy. I'm not particularly comfortable talking about emotions. I live in the most emotionally avoidant city on the face of the earth, right here. And my wife jokes that me writing a book about emotion is like Gandhi writing a book about gluttony. It's not the normal thing that I do. My favorite brain research story, which is apocryphal, unfortunately, is they took a bunch of middle-aged guys, put them in an fMRI machine, had them watch a horror movie, and then had them describe their feelings toward their wives. And the brain scans were the same in both activities, just sheer terror. And so I sort of get that, but the fact is that emotions assign value to things. Emotions tell us what to remember. There are some people who have very unemotional childhoods for odd reasons, and they can't remember their childhoods. And then emotions literally wire the fibers of the brain together. And so in 1945, there was an orphanage out west where they decided the way to raise kids was antiseptically, keep them germ-free. And so they fed them, they gave them good medical care, but they didn't handle them. And the mortality rate by age 2 was 37% at this place. And in fact, they stopped naming the kids because they were dying at such high rates. And so it is the love of a parent that actually literally wires the brain together. Now, the third insight after unconscious and the emotion being the foundation of reason is that we're not primarily self-contained individuals. We're primarily social animals, deeply interpenetrated one with another. And so when we look at each other, we're not only observing what each other are doing, we are reenacting in our own minds what we see other people doing. So if I pick up a glass and they scan your brain, it looks like you're picking up a glass. And if I pick it up to drink it, you're reacting one way. If I pick it up to put in the dishwasher, your brain is reacting another way. So you're not only perceiving, you're judging the intention behind an action at the moment of perception. And that's why emotional contagions can sweep through a crowd or through the Middle East, for example, because things hop very quickly from mind to mind as we reenact each other. And so this happens sometimes by what we see, sometimes by touch. One of my favorite experiments more on the importance of culture is somebody had the bright idea of observing people having coffee and then how much they touched each other. And in Rio, I think it was about 180 touches per hour while they were having coffee. In Paris, it was 120 touches an hour. And in London, it was 0 touches an hour. So we do sort of touch each other as a way to spread messages. We also smell each other a lot. People who suffer loss of the sense of smell suffer a greater emotional deterioration than the loss of any other sense, because we do so much time smelling each other in ways we're not even aware of. In Germany, there was a study done where they take gauze pads, tape it under people's arms. Scientists do this a lot of gauze pads taping. And they had some people watch a horror movie, other people watch a comedy. They had other research subjects, presumably well paid, sniff the gauze pads and say what movie did they watch. And they could tell at way above average chance who watched a comedy, who watched a horror movie. Women were much better at this than men, by the way. And so when you take these 3 foundational ideas, you get a different view of who we are. You come to doubt the French Enlightenment's view, René Descartes' view, that we're primarily rational creatures, that reason is the highest of our faculties. You come to appreciate the Scottish Enlightenment's view, David Hume and Adam Smith, that we're primarily sentimental creatures, that reason is weak, but the sentiments are strong. And sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes the sentiments are intelligent. And so when you come to this, you get a whole different view of human nature, which pervades, I think, the way one sees politics. If you see us primarily as sentimental creatures, if you pay attention to the underwater sphere of unconscious relationships more than conscious reasoning, or as much as. And so it gives you a different view of many things, but especially human capital, what it takes to lead a flourishing life. Now, when we think about human capital, especially out at Burning Tree Elementary in my neighborhood, we think about SATs, grades, IQ, the things we can count and measure, professional skills. And all that is important. Reason is tremendously important. But there are all sorts of other skills which are equally important, at least equally important. And these are things that are both emotional and rational, both conscious and unconscious, and really are hard for us to figure on, but are tremendously important. And so one of those things you would call mind sight, the ability to enter another person's mind and really download the knowledge they have there. And so babies come born with this ability. Alan Meltzoff, is at the University of Washington, leaned over a baby in 1979, wagged his tongue at the baby when the baby was 43 minutes old, and she wagged her tongue back. Even at this very early age, babies are wired to mimic. Babies are phenomenally good at reading faces. You can take a 6-month-old baby, put her in front of, say, 6 different monkeys, and she can tell one monkey from another. As adults, we lose this ability because we don't have to read faces as closely as they do. And so in this country, 55% of the babies have established a relationship where they mimic mostly mom by 18 months of age. And those babies are what they call securely attached. And they have a huge advantage when they go to school because not only do they know how to build a relationship with mom, but when they meet teachers or peers, they have a model for how you build relationships. And so University of Minnesota's big longitudinal study found that by looking at these attachment patterns at 18 months, they could predict with 77% accuracy who is going to graduate from high school, simply because those advantages start very early. 20% of the kids in this country are what they call avoidantly attached. They've sent signals to mom, nothing's come back. They don't have as good models. And one of the teachers in one of the books I read described a kid tacking into the wind, trying to get close to mom, but not knowing quite how to do it. And avoidantly attached kids have many fewer friends through life, and they get less of a kick of social engagement. Now, nothing that happens at 18 months seals you for life. You can have later experience that either confirms or disconfirms, but it opens up pathways. And some people have the ability to really enter into other people's minds and learn. And you're occasionally with these people. I was with Michael Milken, who I'd never met before out in California. And when you're with him, he like lasers into you, and he's going to take whatever you have. I guess in many different ways. But it's an impressive skill. The second skill, I'll just do a few more. Second skill called equipoise, the ability to monitor your own unconscious biases and weaknesses and correct for them. And so human beings are overconfidence machines. 95% of college professors believe they have above average teaching skills. Time magazine asked people, are you in the top 1% of earners? And 19% of Americans are in the top 1% of earners. This overconfidence is a tremendously gender-linked trait. Men drown at twice the rate as women because men have tremendous confidence in their own swimming ability, especially after they've been drinking. But some people have the ability to see their weaknesses and their biases and compensate. And those people have traits that are not really correlated particularly well with IQ, like being open-minded in the face of ambiguity, adjusting the strength of the evidence to the strength of a conclusion, and building modesty bootstrapped for themselves. And so Peter Drucker suggested that when you make a decision, write it down in your reasoning, seal it in an envelope for 9 months, open it up, and you'll discover that a third of your decisions were right, a third were wrong, a third were in between, but in almost all cases, your reasoning will be completely irrelevant. And so that's a sort of modesty bootstrap you can build. The third trait I'll mention is a Greek word, metis, the ability to look over a landscape and to detect patterns in the landscape. My newspaper did a great story about soldiers in Iraq who could look down a street in Baghdad and tell whether there was an IED in the street. And when they were asked, how do you know? They will say, I couldn't really tell you, but I feel a coldness inside. There's something wrong. And this skill is not something you're born with to detect patterns. It's something you get from long experience and arduous observation. And so one experiment, they took chess grandmasters and chess novices and asked them to memorize a chessboard in 5 seconds. Chess grandmasters could do this with no problem. Chess novices could do it, they could memorize like maybe 4 pieces. And that's because the grandmasters didn't see individual pieces, they saw formations of pieces. The difference between memorizing a paragraph of prose versus individual letters. Then they reorganized the pieces so they were in such a way that could never actually happen in a chess game, and the grandmasters were no better than anybody else. And if you practice something, you change the way you see the world, and that comes from arduous observation. The fourth and the final trait I guess I'll mention is what you might call sympathy. And this is the ability to be sensitive to a social environment. So we all tend to be much better in groups than we are as individuals. Somebody had the bright idea of looking at Olympic swimming teams in the last Olympics and comparing the performances as members of a team to their performance, the swimmers' performance as members in their individual events. And swimmers swam much faster when they were part of a relay team than in their individual events because they were motivated to do well for the team. And so groups are smarter than individuals. Groups that meet face-to-face are much smarter than groups that meet separately. And so, for example, the University of Michigan got groups of people together, had them do math problems, gave some groups 10 minutes, but had them meet face-to-face, and they could do the math problems no problem. Other groups had 30 minutes, but they had to communicate by email, and they all broke apart. Because so much of our communication is by intonation of voice, by gesture, by glance. And the smartest groups were not the ones that had the smartest people in them. They were the ones that took turns while talking, where people could read each other's emotional signals. And so some people have this ability to do this. Some people just want to dominate the conversation, are relatively blind. And so there are a whole bunch of traits I could mention that also are part of this thing, that are unconscious, that are hard to quantify, but are actually much more important to how we do in life than the ones that we can measure and really emphasize and put in the back window sticker of our car. And the final thing I'll mention is not so much a trait, but which is a motivation. What the conscious mind wants are the things the magazines write about, which is the ability to, to be good looking, to be rich, to be successful, to be popular. But what the unconscious mind hungers for are those moments when self-awareness, when consciousness really fades away, and you have direct experience by getting lost in something larger than yourself. When a craftsman is lost in a craft, when an athlete is lost in the sport, when a naturalist feels at one with nature, when a religious believer feels at one or lost in God's love, and when most of us feel lost in the love for one another. And so the decision to fall in love is like all the different decisions I've been talking about here. It's half conscious, half unconscious, half rational, half enchanted. And so when we fall in love with people, there is an unconscious logic to our choices. We tend to marry people with similar eye widths to our own, similar nose widths. We tend to marry people with complementary immune systems to ourselves, which we detect by tasting saliva. We tend to marry people with as much status as we can get. And so women tend to like guys who are unfortunately taller. Though I did see a great study that a guy who's 5'6" can get as many online date offers on Match.com as a guy who's 6 foot, so long as he makes $172,000 a year more. And so this is the inner logic to our thinking. We're not really aware of this, but we're thinking for these evolutionary reasons. But there's also, of course, an enchanted element to these decisions. Stendhal had a great phrase called crystallization. He described miners who would throw branches into a salt mine. And then when they'd pick them up weeks later, they'd be covered in crystals, and they would shimmer beautifully in the sun. And he said, this is what we do to our beloved. We cover them in crystals, and so they possess, we see them as possessing skills and traits that maybe they don't actually possess, but it's part of the enchantment of what we do when we fall in love. And the final story I'll tell, which really encapsulates a lot of the different themes I've been talking about here, the power of emotion to really guide our lives, the power of unconscious processes, and the deep interpenetration of people at this level, is a story I came across in a book by a great scientist named Douglas Hofstadter, who's at Indiana University. Now, Hofstadter is a great scientist who's written many great books, and he was on sabbatical with his wife, a woman named Carol, and their 2 kids, who at that point were 5 and 2. And Hofstadter's wife, Carol, very suddenly and very shockingly suffered, I think, a stroke and died very suddenly when their kids were that young. And months later, Hofstadter had a picture of Carol on his bureau in his bedroom. And he would walk through his bedroom and I'm sure see that picture several times a day. But one time he looked at it with a special attention. And this was a few months after her death. And this is what he wrote in his book, which is called I Am a Strange Loop. This is Hofstadter writing. I looked at her face, and I looked so deeply that I felt I was behind her eyes. And all at once I found myself saying, as tears flowed, "That's me, that's me." And those simple words brought back many thoughts that I had had before, about the fusion of our souls into one higher-level entity, about the fact that at the core of both our souls lay our identical hopes and dreams for our children, about the notion that those hopes were not separate or distinct hopes, but were just one hope, one clear thing that had defined us both, that welded us into a unit, the kind of unit I had but dimly imagined before being married and having children. I realized that though Carol had died, that core piece of her had not died at all, but that it had lived on very determinedly in my brain. And so the Greeks say we suffer our way to wisdom, and the wisdom that Hofstadter suffered his way to is that the loops in our brain are shared loops, deeply interpenetrated one with another. And in a shallower and less tragic way, I think the policy failures across a range of fields have reminded us that if we conduct a policy with a shallow view of human nature that ignores the things that are happening below consciousness, if we try to raise our kids this way, if we try to talk about ourselves and our lives this way, we will be disappointed. We'll have insufficient policies, insufficient child-rearing techniques, and insufficient ways of living. And the good news is that we have now in the middle of this revolution in how we think about ourselves, or at least a renaissance in how we think about ourselves, as scientists in many different fields discover what's happening. And when Freud had his vision of the unconscious, it had a very pervasive effect on culture. Now we have these people at NIH and elsewhere doing what they're doing, learning about ourselves, reminding us of who we are, and I think it'll have a wonderful and pervasive effect on our culture in the years to come. So thank you. Sure.
Okay, we've got about 10, maybe 15 minutes of questions. So just stand up. We've got microphones right down here in the front, and let's.
Pardon me, sir. Would you wait for the microphone? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Could I ask, what have you learned from your inquiry about how to improve not only individual behavior, but collective behavior, in particular at institutions, political institutions that you espouse about all the time?
Right. How to change collective behavior. The first thing to do is, as I said, beware teleconferences. Try to meet face-to-face as much as possible. There are certain very practical things that can be done. One of the things they've studied when they study compensation schemes, we tend to pay people by individual performance. The evidence suggests that doesn't particularly work, but if you organize people into teams and compensate as a reward for group achievement, that motivates people a lot more powerfully. The final thing to be said in this context is that pay less attention to the individuals in the organization and more attention to the space between the individuals, the quality of the relationships between the individuals. And as someone who covers Congress, I know many people here have worked or do work in or with Congress, I find them to be pretty admirable individuals. The quality of the relationships are pretty dreadful. And so if you want to, I mentioned the teams that took turns while talking and did well in the math. If, on the other hand, you want to have a picture of a dysfunctional organization, I would say the U.S. Congress is pretty much your perfect example. Not much turn-taking and often not much conversation. And so when I hear a politician start describing to me what people in the other party is thinking and doing, I pretty much know everything I'm about to hear is going to be wrong. And that's because they don't know each other much and don't have those kinds of conversations.
We have a question back right behind us. Go ahead.
What does your research tell you about accountability on the part of, for example, government leaders, and how to foster accountability in government?
That's a timely question, which I can't answer well. First thing I want to say, it's never my research. I'm just reporting on the research. I just spent yesterday at Harvard a time with a woman named Judith Lerner, who runs a lab there, and she focuses on accountability. And her work is incredibly complicated. And I don't claim to understand it all yet. But the short version, which is to the extent I do understand, just saying we're going to hold the rascals accountable and that'll make them behave better, that doesn't work. Because often they don't know why they're not behaving well. And so I think what one has to do is continually think about structuring the context to cause people to work better. One of the key themes through a lot of this research is that we don't have the power consciously to change our minds because there's too much going on down there. That's why New Year's resolutions fail. But we do have the power, A, to change our context. What organization do you belong to and what institutions do you join? If you join the Marine Corps, it'll have a pervasive effect on your mind in the ways you'll never understand, but which will have pervasive effects. So you have the power to change your environment. The second thing you have the power to do is change your behavior. One of the themes is change your behavior first and your mind comes later. Or as the folks at Alcoholics Anonymous put it, fake it till you make it. And if you behave well in small ways, say with etiquette and general politeness, you will lay down grooves in your head that will lead to better behavior when the big temptations come along. And so a lot of changing behavior has to do with changing the context people are in, less saying you did wrong, do better.
I actually read your book and think it's enormously important and really entertaining. My two questions are, one, you've got two characters, right, Harold and Erica, and I feel like Harold. So do people feel like that when they read your book? Are they archetypes? I mean, are people meant to identify with one of your characters or the other? And then the second question is, in the latter half of your book, when Harold goes to work at think tank, I I get really jealous because you talked about how what you're talking about applies to education and social policy and things like that. But you didn't talk about how it applies to energy. So have you thought about that at all? Thanks.
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I do have two characters, and I chose characters to illustrate the book, in part because I think I'm a journalist. I think well with examples. I want to provide examples. I thought it would be more fun to read. And I also thought that since the whole theme of the book is that information hits us on two levels, argumentatively and narratively, that my book should exemplify that. And so that's why I did it. And so the characters are not really quite novel characters, but they're driven by the research. And so everything they do, there's some research saying this is how people behave. And so I guess my goal is that you'll see parts of oneself in maybe each, or one or the other. They're different characters, and Harold is a more cerebral character, I guess. Erica she grows up in poverty and is a more ruthlessly ambitious character, but I think also the stronger character. The one thing I'll say is that I'm not a novelist. It's not a novel. But when novelists say that the characters take over the book, I began to understand what that means, because she was such a strong character. She took over in ways I didn't appreciate in the beginning. And so I did it for that. As for energy policy, my general view of energy policy, I confess, is that I sit next door to Tom Friedman, so that's his job. So yeah, I confess I haven't thought about it much. I will say one thing about the unconscious. I mentioned a lot of its strengths. The unconscious is very bad at math, and particularly bad at calculating risks. And so that might play into energy policy.
Back here, and then I'll come back down here to...
Validating some of the things you're talking about. Last night, we had an event here, Bob Schaefer's forum that he has. He had 4 United States senators retired. Tom Daschle was one of them, Warner from Virginia. And when they were asked the bottom line thing of what is wrong with Congress today, they unanimously agreed, Republicans and Democrats alike, that it was because there was no contact between these people anymore. They're sleeping in their offices. They're going back home every weekend. And so it just really confirms everything you said, and I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, well, just my pet peeve of the week is that I was just over at the White House for a briefing on the budget, and they talked a lot about Paul Ryan this, Paul Ryan that. And I spent a lot of time with Paul Ryan. I debate him on various issues. I don't agree with him a lot. I agree with him on some things, not on others, but I spent a lot of time with him. And so I'm sitting there for like an hour hearing their views of Paul Ryan, and I know this for a fact, none of them have ever had a conversation with Paul Ryan. The president has never had a conversation with Paul Ryan. And they've had some televised events they've done together, but never any conversation. So I felt like saying, you guys don't know squat about Paul Ryan. You have views, but at least, you'll disagree. They do disagree, but at least meet the guy. And that's the problem with Washington. And the only solution is bourbon. We should enforce drinking together.
David, what's the role of technology in this gap?
Well, a couple things. One is, as I say, it's no substitute for face-to-face. But one of the questions I've sort of been grappling with, say for the younger generation, does Facebook and texting replace friendship, or do people try to use it to replace friendship or to supplement normal friendship? And I think the evidence, there are two bits of evidence. One, I think for most people, it supplements friendship. So the fact that texting and Facebook and cell phones are replacing neighborhood meetings, well, they're not quite. They're helping people get together. And so I think the most alarmist fears that we're being all driven into our basements by Facebook and texting, that we're all being divorced from another, I don't think the evidence really suggests that. And so people use Facebook to get together because hormones still happen. And there are certain biological drives that people want to fulfill. You can't mention them at CSIS. So but no, my first event, it was with Dr. Ruth here. It was no, I'm just kidding. But the final thing to be said, and I just read a study on this, was they looked very closely at Facebook use, for example, and they said it's not the technology, it's what the people bring to the technology. So some people bring to the technology, I want to meet a lot of people, and here's how I'm going to develop my relationships. Some people use Facebook because they feel lonely, and this is the way they cope with their loneliness. And so the technology is not the medium is not always the message. It's what you bring to the technology that's important.
Sir, I'm going to give you the benediction, and I'll let you wrap it up. I'm sorry.
Thanks very much. It's a great honor to have the benediction. I was thinking about the children that you were describing in Bethesda and the way that they're only being taught in a rational way. Do you think there's any way to establish some sort of pedagogy in the emotional maturity or the social skills that you mention, or is just an awareness of them enough to lead people to start to treat their children and other people in a way that will develop these skills?
Right. Well, I think the kids in Bethesda are affluent enough and privileged enough that they get most of the social skills. One of the things you learn about, there's a great scientist named Eric Turkheimer at UVA who says to be a great parent, all you have to do is establish relationships with kids. All the Mandarin flashcards, that doesn't do anything. And so most upper middle class parents, they establish fine relationships, and that's basically what you should do. But what isn't there, I think, is first there's too much of an emphasis on the as I say, the grades and the Tiger Momization. When the Tiger Mom wrote her book, she made her kids go to take piano lessons and get straight A's, but she forbade them from going to sleepovers. And so I wrote a little column saying, if you want to know what's actually cognitively demanding, it's a 14-year-old girl going to sleepover with 7 other 14-year-old girls. That is cognitively very complicated. I should say not that I know from personal experience. But so that sort of stuff is tremendously important. But then, when they get to college, and I did a study at Princeton, I did a bunch of reporting, and I asked the professors, do you teach character here? And they said, well, we think they should develop it, but we don't really know what to say. And so that's why I say there's an inarticulateness. And so the prevailing breeze blows you toward workaholism because there's an inarticulateness about the other side. And I think that's genuinely a problem, and it can only be corrected when you pay attention to this lower level and see that this is the stuff that actually, A, leads to happiness, but B, it's actually driving you anyway. It's not the stuff you're consciously learning.
Until this hour, I've never wished I were younger. I've always been glad to get older, but I wish I were younger to learn more. This has been a fascinating afternoon. I wish I had many more hours to listen to you, David. We have to let you go. You've got obligations. Everybody say thank you with your applause for this.